So my parents just bought a new house because they want to live closer to us when we retire, and I want to make them a cutting board as a housewarming gift. The problem is they move in this month, and because I've had to work a lot of long hours, I haven't even gotten started on it yet. Now, if I were doing just any old cutting board, that'd be okay, but I want to personalize it. So I bought a new laser, but I have to put it together, figure out how to use it, and then personalize it. And as if that wasn't already hard enough, I want it to be sitting on their counter when they move in. So I've got to figure out who their realtor is and then mail it to her, which compresses the timeline even more. This one's going to be a challenge.
Challenge accepted.
So let's get after it. All right, so I've been doing some research to get some inspiration online, and I've narrowed it down to this one. It looks like maple and walnut and maybe some padauk, but I really like the contrasting woods and the pinstriping they got going on there. So this is the one I'm gonna go with. But I don't have any padauk, so I'm gonna have to go to the store. So there I was at my local woodcraft, minding my own business, looking for some padauk, and what do you know, they have Purple Heart half off up front. And apparently I can't pass up a good deal. So I got to thinking, maybe this is an opportunity to make something unique. So what I'm thinking is, I'm not sure whether they're gonna like the red of the padauk or the purple more. And let's be honest, I'm their son, they're gonna like whatever I make them, but I can make them something that they've never seen before. So what I'm thinking is I can make the accent strip with a top and a bottom. So if you're looking at the cutting board, you have to imagine the maple and the walnut as well. But if you're looking at the cutting board from the side, the top can be padauk and the bottom can be Purple Heart, so that whichever one they like more, they just flip that side up. I've never even heard of anything like this being done before. Maybe it has, I don't know. But this is a chance to make something unique and give them something that I know they'll want because they can pick which one they like more. The first thing I need to do is to get all my rough lumber cut down to size. Starting with the maple, I put the boards on my planer sled and got one side cleaned up, and then used that clean side face down to get the other side perfectly parallel. And then I did the same thing for the walnut, the padauk, and the Purple Heart. Then I used my straight edge jig to put a clean edge on each board and then cut the strips to width. The walnut wasn't quite thick enough, so I had to glue two boards together to get the thickness that I wanted. Once the glue had dried, I cleaned off one edge and then cut the strips down to size. And then after a couple of passes through my drum sander, they were ready to go. All right, so I had a little bit of a snag. I ran out of the curly maple board that I was using, and it just wasn't giving me the width of the cutting board that I was wanting. So I had to go get another curly maple board, and the color just doesn't match perfectly, so I staggered it, kind of gives it a little bit more character. So we're hoping that it'll come out nice. So here's what I've got. As you can see, the padauk is on top, and on the bottom, you can see I've got the Purple Heart as well. So the first thing I need to do is go glue these two together in pairs so that I can glue them widthwise when that's dry. All right, so now I've got it all set up and ready to glue up. I've got it set up in my juice groove jig so that I can clamp it to one of the fences over here and keep it all straight and flush to the bottom, so at least one side is actually flush. This is going to be a little bit of a complicated glue up because I've got different heights and whatnot just because how I cut them, but now I just need to glue it, clamp it, and let it sit overnight. Now, since I didn't cut all the strips to the same width, when I flipped them on their side to glue them up, they weren't the same height, so I couldn't glue them all at the same time. so I had to apply and spread the glue one at a time. This took a little while. Once they had glue on them, I clamped them all up and let them dry overnight. Once the glue was dry, I took them out of the clamps and put it on my planer sled to get the top side completely flat. And then I went over to the miter saw and got a nice flat end on the board, and then gave it a few final passes in the planer to make sure the top and the bottom were completely parallel and flat. Then, to make sure that all my angles were at 90 degrees, I used this right angle attachment for my track saw and made cuts on each end. Then, after putting a round over bit in my palm router, I rounded over all of the edges on the top and the bottom and the sides. Then I switched out the bit to make the juice groove. Alright, so me from the future here. This was when I realized that my juice groove jig just wasn't big enough for the cutting board that I was making. And when I realized this, I also realized that I had just busted my timeline. It's just not going to make it there in time. So at this point, I had to ditch the idea that I was going to be able to personalize it, and it just wasn't going to make it there before they moved in. They're going to have to get it in the mail a day or two after they moved in. So I got to work making a bigger jig, and soon I was back in business and could proceed with the project. This was one of many lessons that I learned in this project, all of which I'll go over at the end of the video. After the juice groove was complete, I gave it a good sanding on all the surfaces and spent a lot of time on the juice groove. Then I sprayed it down with water to raise the wood fibers and gave it another final sanding. Then it was time to give it a bath in cutting board oil in my homemade aluminum foil tray. And then finally, I used some cutting board wax to finish it off. Okay, so before I show you the final product, I want to share with you some lessons that I learned during this project so that you don't make the same mistakes. In the military, we call this a debrief. So first of all, I was really rushed during this project. And anytime you're rushed in the wood shop, you need to be aware for a couple of reasons. First of all, and maybe this is just me, when I'm rushed, I make mistakes, or at least oversights. In this case, I didn't plan properly beforehand, so I blew my timeline so it didn't get there on time. It got there the day after they moved in, but also I wasn't able to personalize the cutting board like I wanted to. And now sometimes we all have short deadlines, or maybe sometimes it's self-imposed, but the second reason why rushing is a problem is shop safety. Anytime you're rushing through a project, you need to be hyper aware that there's more danger involved in rushing through a project, and you have to be very diligent with your safety measures so you don't get injured. So there's two main lessons here. Do your proper prior planning ahead of time, and if you can help it, don't be rushed. The second mistake that I made is that I ran out of wood. During the project, I realized I didn't have enough curly maple, and the board just looked really goofy being as narrow as it was. So I had to kind of think on the fly, go get another board, which is another trip to the store, and then I had to figure out, even though it was a little bit different, how it could still look good. So the lesson learned here is that you make sure that you have calculated the amount of wood that you need and get it all before you start the project. All right, so number 3 is that my strips were different lengths. Now I mentioned this in the video, but it bears repeating. When you're making a cutting board, make sure that all your strips are the same width so that when you go to glue it up, they're the same height and will make your glue up a lot easier. And lesson number 4 is that I didn't have enough of the right size clamps before I started the glue up. Now I did make do with what I had, but it would have been more ideal if I had gotten enough clamps from the store before I started my project. So if your project includes a glue up, make sure you've got enough of the right size clamps. And then the 5th and last lesson is that I didn't have the right size juice groove jig for the size cutting board that I was trying to make. The jig that I made was for the last cutting board that I made, which was much more narrow, and I didn't even think about it before the project. Now there's two lessons I've learned from this. The first is to make sure that you make all the jigs required before you start your project. But the second lesson is, if you can, make these jigs so that they are scalable and they can fit any kind of possible project that you have in the future. So for instance, if I had made the juice groove jig for my first cutting board way bigger than I needed it, then I can make whatever size cutting board in the future and I would have a jig for it. All right, now it's time to take a look at the finished product. So here's how it turned out. Check out the richness of the Purple Heart and how the Padauk just pops with the color contrast. And after my parents had it for a while, they liked using the Purple Heart side for show because it matched their kitchen better, and used the Padauk side as the cutting board. Well, that's it for this video. We'll see you next time.